Excuse me?
Are you prepared to stand here all night if we decide to stay?
I guess, yeah.
All right, well, you just stay right there then. And you just stay and stand.
Why are you letting us go to that desk like we were able to do last year?
No, he's not a U.S. employee.
This is a public institution.
Did Elon Musk hire you? Who do you work for?
Who do you work for? Are you not aware of? Are you even
Who do you work for?
I'm a federal employee working for the education.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, that was a video that was posted by Congressman Maxwell Alejandro Frost. He wrote in the tweet, "They are blocking members of Congress from entering the Department of Education. Elon is allowed in and not the people. Illegal." Can you speak on the legality of what we're seeing right here?
Yeah, Brian, as I watched that clip, it's clearly outrageous. It's contemptible. The question of whether it's illegal is another question. You know, when we see members of Congress who are being denied access to public buildings, federal government buildings, the Department of Education, you know, it strikes us as wrong. But I think, in fairness, we need to talk about what security at federal government office buildings looks like. And, you know, I was inside government, the federal government, for decades, so I'm pretty familiar with the security procedures and the security forces. Now, first of all, you're going to have a different kind of security at, for example, the Pentagon than you might have at, you know, HHS or the Department of Education. But generally, here's what security looks like in federal government buildings in Washington, D.C. There's something called the Federal Protective Service, the FPS, we call it. Those are armed security officers with arrest powers, and they, by and large, provide security for federal government buildings, property, federal government employees, and visitors to federal government buildings. But there are only about 1,200 or so FPS sworn security members, and they fall under DHS, the Department of Homeland Security. So the far greater number of security officers are what we affectionately refer to as blue coats. Why? Because their uniform involves a blue blazer. So those are private security contractors that the federal government contracts with, and they are at virtually all federal government buildings. They don't have the power of arrest, but what they can do, and I've actually seen blue coats do this, if somebody is acting up inside a government building, they can ask them to leave 3 times, and if they don't, they can either, you know, escort them out because then they become trespassers, or they can detain them, call the Federal Protective Service officers, and they will come over and exercise their arrest power. So when we see all of these members of Congress, understandably wanting to get into the Department of Education to see, you know, what in the heck Elon and his little, you know, 20-something-year-old henchmen may be doing in there that are damaging to our government systems and our privacy interests, and we see them not being permitted to enter, here's what people should know. Ordinarily, when somebody wants to go into a government building, they have to be sponsored. What does that mean? Let me use a concrete example. If somebody wanted to come to the U.S. Attorney's Office, which is in Judiciary Square in D.C., we would have thousands of people in and out of our building every day, police officers, witnesses, defense attorneys, etc. What would happen is I would call down to the kiosk at the front door, and I would have to provide the name, the identifiers, and the time that I expected, for example, a witness that I was going to interview to appear at the U.S. Attorney's Office. That person would have to show ID, would have to be logged into the computer system, and would be generated a security tag that they would affix to their jacket or their shirt, and then they had to be escorted to my office. Sometimes I would just come down and bring the witness up to my office. So it's not as if members of the general public, even members of Congress, can just waltz into every government building. There are procedures. Now, that does not answer the question about who in the world is this guy that we see in the clip with the little children's bandage on his neck saying, I'm not allowing members of Congress to come in and see what Elon Musk is doing. That is my take on what he's saying. You can't really hear much of the conversation. So there are a lot of unanswered questions, and the optics are terrible that members of Congress are not being permitted in, and Elon Musk and his, you know, little staff of computer people are permitted in. It looks bad. I can't say that it is necessarily illegal.
Is there some rule in terms of how they have to present themselves? I mean, this is just a guy in a t-shirt. Is that generally how security forces, even the ones that are contracted private security forces, have to comport themselves?
No, the Federal Protective Service officers or the contract security officers, the blue coats that I mentioned, they all have uniform. They are all clearly working in a security capacity. I don't know who in the world this guy is that we see in that clip, but I'm sure somebody will be identifying him soon, and we'll figure out, is this really an FPS member? Is it a blue coat, a contract security specialist, or is it just somebody that, Elon Musk picked up off the street and said, hey, don't let anybody in while I'm in there?
And if it's the latter, because it may very well be, if it's the latter where he just finds somebody off the street, somebody associated with Elon Musk, and says don't let anybody in, then can you explain the legality of that, of planting somebody who doesn't have the requisite authority to be there, being anointed some security ambassador for the Department of Education, for example?
Yeah, that would be wrongful conduct on any number of levels. For example, you can't impersonate a federal officer of any kind, including an FPS, a Federal Protective Services security officer. And if he's holding him out as one, that could actually violate federal law. If you are blocking entrance to a public facility, that is actually something that we call, and this is this is an old-timey word for a crime that we don't really enforce all that much anymore. There is a law called incommoding. You're not allowed to block, the entrance or exits of certain buildings. So there are lots of potential crimes that might be involved depending on who he is, what authority he has, who gave him that authority, and whether he is misrepresenting his authority in any way. But you can't just post yourself on a public building, a government building, and tell people they can't come in or they can't leave. That could potentially violate any number of federal or local laws of the District of Columbia.
Glenn, this is a bit of a political question as opposed to a legal one, but it seems here, and obviously we don't have a ton of context surrounding this snippet of this video, but can you talk about whether you think the optics, even from the Democrats' perspective, is correct if basically it's just arguing with somebody who they don't know whether he has the authority or not to be there, but taking him at his word? Doesn't that in and of itself kind of imbue this guy with power, the fact that they are giving it to him and treating him as if he should be there? Doesn't that thereby imbue him with the very power that he may not even have the authority to have?
It does, Brian, and that's one of the things that concerned me the most when I saw our elected officials, several of them, sort of, standing there arguing with this guy who, if he is a security official, is plainly not properly dressed,
right,
is displaying no insignia that would indicate he's a member of any kind of a security force, whether governmental or contract. I don't like the optics of it, because, here we are with our elected officials being stonewalled by one guy with a child's bandage on his neck. And, and it looks bad, it feels bad, it smells bad. But here is my main concern, kind of drilling down on the legal front or on the procedural front. Let me put it that way, not knowing the circumstances. Let me make that clear. Ordinarily, you are permitted to come into the front door, to go to the front desk or kiosk or booth and say, I am here to see so-and-so who works in this, governmental agency. And the fact that he's keeping them all on the outside, now I would need to see more about the security setup, but, it looks bad sort of in every conceivable way.
And finally, let's finish off with this. Do you think that had the Democrats just barged in, that there would have been any consequences for them? I mean, even if a Democratic official gets arrested, they're not going to stay incarcerated. And so really, what are the downsides of these people opting not to treat him as if he's a legitimate security guard, but instead saying that's all well and good, I'm coming in?
Yeah, if they barge through doors onto federal property where they had no authority to be because they breached the security, the legitimate security of the government property, that would technically might violate federal laws. But let's talk about the local crime in the District of Columbia of what we call unlawful entry. We shorthand it as a UE. It is what people think of as a trespass. They could be arrested. Now, you just asked a question, and internally I was cringing because you said, it's not like they're going to be, locked up. They're not going to be detained. They may not even be, officially charged with a crime. Have you seen Pam Bondi's enemies list that she issued on day one? When she testified under oath definitively, if confirmed, there will be no enemies list at the Department of Justice. And on day one, she published an enemies list. She said, we're going after Jack Smith and Alvin Bragg and Letitia James and the investigators and prosecutors on the J6 cases. That's an enemies list, Brian, and it's one she had no business publishing because she doesn't even know if there's adequate predication, enough evidence to investigate any of these people. I suspect they're not, because they were all doing their jobs in accordance with the law. So, to answer the question, it's not like these people are going to catch a formal charge of unlawful entry and be prosecuted. I would say, you know what? Given Pam Bondi is now the Attorney General and setting Trump's priorities for the Department of Justice rather than the priorities of the American people, I wouldn't be so sure about that.
Well, that's a great point about not handing off some predicate for Pam Bondi to then go in and seek vengeance or retribution against some Democratic officials, because I know that, basically if she has an opening and if she can take an inch, then she'll take a mile. So we will, of course, stay on top of this as we continue to find out what the legitimacy of these security officers are, as opposed to whether they were just, some henchmen put in place by Elon Musk. For those who are watching right now, if you want to continue to follow along as we wait for some answers here, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.